Hi, my name is Angus Vail, and I hope you're all well and staying safe in these crazy times. I'm very honoured to be introducing for Shakespeare 2020 what I think is one of the best plays in the entire canon, Henry IV Part 1. Part 2 is pretty good too. And unlike many of the people who have been introducing the plays in this project, I am not a professor. But I am perhaps over-enthusiastic fanboy, Shakespeare fanboy. And I am in the process of building a modern reimagining of Shakespeare's original globe, but our globe is being built out of modified and repurposed shipping containers like this. And we're calling it the Container Globe. And this is what it'll look like. I apologize for the low tech, but so really it is a collection of rows of 9 containers and 40-foot containers for the stage, and it preserves the playing atmosphere and the dimensions of the original globe as far as we know, and this is what it will look like at night. So we were going to be putting the container globe up, a prototype up this year, but COVID came along, blew all those plans up. So now what we're doing is we're putting together, it's really kind of an arrangement, it's like an outdoor Blackfriars where we are putting the containers in an arrangement that preserves social distancing. And then when a vaccine comes along, we'll be able to take that apart and build the globe proper. So anyway, back to the play, most importantly. Shakespeare wrote Henry IV Part 1 in 1597, 2 years after Richard II. So I sort of look at it, it was kind of like season 2 of Game of Thrones coming out. Very exciting, but with less dragons. So when we come to Henry IV, the usurper Bolingbroke has taken the crown, but now he's sick and he's sleepless, and the affairs of state weigh very heavily upon him. There's unrest all over his land, and he dreams of going to the Holy Land to do penance for the killing of his predecessor, Richard II. But it's a bit of a forlorn hope. Because he has to deal with all his far-flung, crazy cousins and uncles, and the Scots and the Welsh, and he starts the play haggling over some high-ranking Scottish prisoners that have been taken in a recent battle by his ostensible allies, the Percys, who are a powerful family from the north of England. Prisoners were very valuable because high-ranking prisoners could be ransomed for a lot of money, and so even while Henry is berating the young Harry Percy, nicknamed Hotspur, he's also ruminating about his feckless son Prince Hal, and how he wishes a fairy had exchanged the baby Hotspur with baby Hal. It's kind of sad. So then we leave the king at Windsor and move to the London lodgings of Prince Hal, and we meet his pal Forstaff, the fantastic fat knight, who I think is one of the best characters in all of Shakespeare, and really of all time. And when we were growing up, we had some family friends had a really fat cat called Falstaff, and who used to both claw the furniture to pieces, but he also entertained everyone with his crazy and bizarre antics. And I used to wonder about that strange name. But when I first saw Henry IV, I totally understood it, totally got it. And Forstaff was an instant hit with Shakespeare's audience, and so he brought him back in The Merry Wives of Windsor and in Henry IV Part 2. But then we find him dead at the beginning of Henry V, which I always think is a bit of a shame. Sir John Falstaff is not a historical character, but he's so great. He's great in mirth and girth that to me he's totally real. There is a connection to a real man in history called Sir John Oldcastle, and he was a friend of the real Prince Hal, But Oldcastle wasn't fat, he wasn't old, and to our knowledge he wasn't a drunkard. Unfortunately for Oldcastle though, when Hal became Henry V, Oldcastle was arrested for being a religious heretic, and he refused to renounce his heresy, and unfortunately was executed by being roasted over a slow fire. And even his friendship with his old mate Prince Hal, and now the King, couldn't save him. And there was also another reference, there was a real Sir John Falstaff who fought with Henry V in France, and apparently on one occasion was accused of cowardice. He defended himself successfully against that charge. And in Shakespeare's play, Forstaff does appear to act cowardly in a couple of scenes. But it seems to me he's just being smart by staying well clear of danger. And Forstaff is always the smartest guy in the room, and he's also the smartest guy on the battlefield. In the play, Hal and Forstaff are always engaging in this constant battle of wits, hurling insults at each other, which, though they're ostensibly in jest, the jabs cut pretty close at times. And their thrust and parry is one of the things I really love about this play. At one stage, Hal calls Falstaff "my old lad of the castle," which Shakespeare brilliantly refers to both the castle, which was a well-known London brothel at the time, but also as a name check to perhaps to St John Oldcastle. And what I find really interesting about this play is especially how Prince Hal and the Prince Hal Falstaff relationship can be played. And I've seen it where Falstaff is the jolly fat rogue, verbally jousting with his and going on mad misadventures with his tearaway young friend. But I've also seen it played where Falstaff is kind of scheming to stay in Prince Hal's close orbit and hoping for advancement when Hal becomes king. And Hal admits in the play that he is really just playing at being a young wastrel. And Hal fully intends to abandon his bad ways and his bad friends and step into the role of king when he needs to. And so to him, his wild youth is really just a deliberate ploy to increase his eventual greatness as king by showing the contrast to his, when he becomes king, to his early escapades. And of course, since this is Shakespeare, there's all different colours and ways and shades to this complex relationship. It's often hysterically funny, but in the end it will end up tragic for Falstaff. So let's go back to the king and his own battles with the Percys. And it's not just about Hotspur's prisoners, but it's also about Sir Edmund Mortimer, who is Hotspur's brother-in-law, and he's being held by the Welsh at this stage. The king can't afford to pay Mortimer's ransom, but he doesn't want to admit it. So either the king takes Hotspur's prisoners, ransoms them to the Scots, gets the money and pays Mortimer's ransom to the Welsh, or Hotspur can ransom his prisoners, take the money from the Scots, pay it to the Welsh. So either way, the money goes from the Scots to the Welsh. So either way, it doesn't matter really if the king or Hotspur does it, but it's a matter of pride. Hotspur becomes completely enraged against the king. His family are worried about, they want to keep Hotspur hot because they need him for the coming rebellion, but they don't want him to boil over and do something rash. So they tell Hotspur about the plan, the plot they have to rebel against the king. And Hotspur goes on this great sort of rant against Prince Hal, and he calls him a sword and a buckler, which was a reference to the swords, really the sort of weapons of the lower class. Then the action shifts back to Prince Hal in London, and he's planning an elaborate misadventure involving a highway robbery, which really is just a scheme to set up and shame Falstaff. And there's a lot of hijinks, and when it's all over, Falstaff, back in London, Falstaff defends himself brilliantly and hilariously. And Hal has to fend off a visit by the sheriff, who's looking for a very fat man as the suspect in the robbery. But in the end, when Falstaff is asleep Prince Hal turns very serious, saying that he'll return the stolen money with interest to the merchants that they robbed. And it's almost in a way, it's a portent of what will eventually happen when Hal becomes king. We then go back to Hotspur now, who's in Wales with his co-conspirators Glendower and the newly freed Mortimer. Glendower tries to claim supernatural powers, but Hotspur just sneers at him, and it shows Hotspur's quickness to anger and his lack of judgment in a way, because while he's poo-pooing Glendower, Glendower is also a much-needed ally in their planned rebellion. Everybody gets very angry at Hotspur, but eventually they all make up enough so they all ride off and take their rebel army to the field. Let's go back to London, where King Henry and Prince Hal have a very uncomfortable meeting. It doesn't start off well, because Hal turns up and actually finds King Henry sleeping. So Hal grabs the crown, tries it on. He thinks actually his father's dead, so he tries the crown on. Henry wakes up, sees Hal with a crown, and gets very mad. He thinks that Hal is sort of over-enthusiastically grasping for the crown, and Hal is in great repute with Henry anyway. So the king, even though Hotspur is now their enemy, King Henry compares Hal unfavourably with Hotspur, and that is really the final straw that does it for Hal. And so Hal promises earnestly to Henry that he'll make his dad proud of him. So the next scene is Hal and Forstaff together. Hal tells him he's paid back the stolen money, and that he's procured Falstaff a charge of foot, which really is kind of a big honour for Falstaff, because Falstaff can be the officer in charge of a group of infantrymen for the forthcoming war. So in a way, sort of Hal's setting his friend up to do something honourable. We'll see how that goes. After that, we see Hotspur in the field at Shrewsbury with his allies, but things are starting to look pretty bad for Hotspur, because one of his allies is sick, and Glendower is on the way, but he's delayed 2 weeks before he and his force can join Hotspur in the field. The king's forces are on their way, and there's a great scene, fantastic scene, where Falstaff is in Coventry, and he's been given £300 to enlist the group of men, the charge of foot. So Falstaff goes and drafts or enlists a bunch of men who basically pay him off so that to avoid this forced enlistment. So Falstaff even makes more money off these guys. Then he goes off and finds a bunch of miserable wretches from the absolute dregs of society. And it's pretty bad behaviour in a way, but in some ways I think it's sort of Shakespeare once again showing his distaste for war, because he's sort of maybe showing that war not only is destructive, kills lots of people, but it's also corrupts many people around the war itself. So King and Hal have a meeting with Hotspur in the field and his allies, and the prince challenges Hotspur to single combat as a way of deciding the battle. The king's impressed with Hal, but he doesn't want to risk his heir, so he offers amnesty to the rebels if they'll lay down their arms. And since it's not certain that the king's offer will be accepted, the king's army prepares for battle. And this leads to one of my favourite all-time favourite speeches in Shakespeare. Falstaff is alone, and he muses on the nature of honour. Both honour in the sense of virtue and bravery, but also military prowess. And Falstaff just derides this honour fantastically. Falstaff is just way too smart to fall for this empty vessel honour. That honour will do him absolutely no good if he dies to gain it. So the battle starts, and we find Falstaff has lost all his men after deliberately basically leading them into a hot spot of the battle, maybe to get rid of them all as quickly as possible so that Falstaff maybe can pocket their pay until it's found out that his whole company is dead. And Falstaff is completely unscratched. Yay, Falstaff. The next point, Hal runs up to Falstaff. He's lost his sword and he asks Falstaff to borrow his sword or his pistol. But of course, Falstaff has a bottle of booze in his pistol pouch, and he refuses to give Hal his sword. So Hal's absolutely disgusted at Falstaff that he's carrying around booze instead of a Forstaff. But hey, Falstaff is Falstaff at all times. Hal then ends up saving his father just as Henry is about to be killed, and then Hal squares off against Hotspur, whom he kills, and it's quite a touching scene. But of course, in the meantime, Falstaff has fallen down pretending to be dead to avoid being killed, and Hal finds Falstaff, thinks he's dead, and there's another touching scene where Hal is really sorry and sad that Falstaff is dead. But once Hal leaves, the incorrigible Falstaff gets up, sees Hotspur's body, stabs it, and carts it off to try and claim a reward for killing Hotspur. And Hal is amazed to see Falstaff alive. He's very pleased, and though he tells Falstaff that he killed Hotspur, he's just amused at his old friends scheming old tricks, and Hal decides to just let it slide. So in the end, the magnificent but deeply dodgy Falstaff walks off with Hotspur's body on his back. Hooray, Falstaff! I hope you enjoy your reading of this brilliant play. Thanks very much.